Certainly. Here's the opening for your video story. The afternoon sun was just beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the small town's main street. Inside a quiet, locally owned grocery store, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, the air was thick with the warmth of chatter and the faint hum of an old refrigerator in the back. It was the kind of day where time seemed to move a little slower, and the worries of the world felt distant. Among the handful of shoppers was an elderly man named Harold, a retired farmer with a gentle demeanor and hands calloused from years of honest work. He wore a faded flannel shirt and jeans that had seen better days, yet he carried himself with a quiet pride. Harold's life wasn't perfect. He lived alone on the edge of town after his wife's passing. But he found solace in the simple things: tending to his garden, feeding the stray cat that wandered onto his porch, and exchanging pleasantries with anyone he met. Today, however, was different. Harold had come to the store to pick up a few necessities: flour, some canned goods, and a little treat for himself, a small bag of his favorite peppermints. He approached the checkout line, his items neatly arranged in his basket, and waited patiently as the line inched forward. Behind him, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit shuffled impatiently, his polished shoes tapping against the floor. This was Arthur, a sharp-tongued businessman who had recently moved to town. Arthur's presence was hard to ignore. He carried an air of entitlement that seemed to fill the room. With a phone pressed to his ear, he barked orders to someone on the other end, drawing the curious eyes of other shoppers. When it was finally Harold's turn, he carefully placed his items on the counter, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his wallet. He smiled at the young cashier, who greeted him warmly. But before Harold could finish paying, Arthur stepped forward. "Can you hurry up, old man?" Arthur snapped, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "Some of us have places to be." The room fell silent. Harold froze, caught off guard by the sudden hostility. He turned slightly, offering an apologetic smile. "I'll just be a moment," Harold said quietly, his voice steady but kind. Arthur, however, was unimpressed. "A moment? You're wasting everyone's time," he said, waving a hand dramatically. The tension in the room grew, and before anyone could intervene, Arthur reached out and smacked the edge of Harold's shoulder, causing him to stumble slightly. Gasps filled the air. Harold steadied himself, his face a mixture of hurt and disbelief. Unbeknownst to everyone, in the far corner of the store, a man who had been quietly observing the scene unfolded from his lean against a display of potato chips. He wore a simple black jacket, his dark hair slightly tousled, and a pair of sunglasses rested in his hand. There was something familiar about him, though few could immediately place it. Keanu Reeves. The Hollywood star had been in town for a low-key vacation, drawn to the area's serene landscapes and quiet charm. He hadn't planned on being noticed. This was supposed to be a break from the spotlight. But now, standing mere feet from the unfolding drama, his jaw tightened. Keanu moved a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. His presence went unnoticed by Arthur, who continued to berate Harold. The elderly man stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, trying to diffuse the situation with quiet words. But Keanu knew something had to be done. Just as Arthur raised his voice again, a soft but firm voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The stall fell silent once more. Arthur turned, his irritation evident, but as his eyes landed on the man behind him, his expression shifted. Recognition dawned, and for a brief moment, he seemed to falter. The other shoppers stared, their curiosity mingling with anticipation. Keanu's calm yet commanding presence was magnetic, and all eyes were on him as he took another step forward, his gaze steady and unyielding. What would happen next was anyone's guess, but one thing was certain. The situation had just taken a turn no one could have expected. "Let me know if you'd like adjustments or additions." Arthur blinked, his mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came out. The weight of the situation had shifted, and he could feel it pressing down on him. Keanu stood firm, his expression calm but resolute, as if silently daring Arthur to continue his tirade. Harold, still clutching the edge of the counter for balance, looked between the two men. He didn't recognize the man who had come to his defense, but there was something about his presence that felt oddly reassuring. The other shoppers whispered amongst themselves, exchanging glances filled with curiosity and quiet awe. Arthur finally found his voice, though it was softer now, lacking the earlier bravado. "This doesn't concern you," he muttered, his eyes darting to the floor. Keanu didn't move. "It concerns everyone," he said, his tone steady and deliberate. "When you treat people with disrespect, you make it everyone's problem." The store grew even quieter. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft shuffling of feet as a few customers moved closer, eager to see what would happen next. Arthur straightened his shoulders, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "Look, I don't have time for this," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "I'm not the bad guy here." He was just trying to buy groceries. Keanu interrupted, his voice cutting through Arthur's excuses. "Like everyone else here." Arthur faltered again, the sharpness in Keanu's tone leaving him momentarily speechless. Harold finally spoke, his voice trembling but firm. "It's all right," he said, addressing Keanu with a small, grateful nod. "I don't want any trouble." Keanu turned to Harold, his expression softening. "You're not the one causing trouble," he said gently. The quiet strength in his words seemed to resonate with Harold, who stood a little taller, his hands no longer shaking. Arthur shifted uncomfortably, the attention of the room firmly fixed on him. His usual tactics, intimidation, bluster, weren't working, and he didn't know what to do. For a moment, he seemed to consider walking away, but his pride wouldn't let him. Instead, he scoffed, muttering something under his breath, and turned back to the counter. "Just finish up," he said gruffly, avoiding eye contact. The cashier hesitated, glancing at Keanu as if seeking permission to proceed. Keanu gave a small nod, and the young woman quickly rang up Harold's items, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. As Harold gathered his groceries and turned to leave, he paused, looking back at Keanu. "Thank you," he said softly, his eyes filled with genuine gratitude. Keanu offered a faint smile, the kind that said more than words ever could. Harold nodded once more, then shuffled toward the door, his steps a little steadier than before. But even as the immediate conflict seemed to settle, the atmosphere in the store remained charged. Arthur stood stiffly by the counter, his jaw clenched and his fists balled at his sides. Keanu, meanwhile, lingered near the display of potato chips, his gaze following Harold until the older man disappeared through the door. On with quiet words. The other shoppers began to disperse, though the air buzzed with murmurs and stolen glances. A few people recognized Keanu now, their whispers growing more animated as they pieced together his identity. One brave soul, a young man in a hoodie, approached cautiously. "Hey man," he said, his voice low. "That was cool of you. You know, standing up for him like that." Keanu glanced at the young man, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes, it's the right thing to do," he said simply. The young man nodded, clearly starstruck, but trying to play it cool. "Yeah, totally. Are you? Are you staying around here?" Keanu didn't answer directly. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "Just passing through," he said, his tone light but non-committal. The young man grinned awkwardly, sensing the conversation was over. "Right. Well, thanks for, you know." He gestured vaguely toward the counter, then retreated, joining a group of friends who were eagerly discussing what they'd just witnessed. Keanu stayed where he was, his thoughts far away. There was something about the encounter that lingered with him, something he couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just Arthur's behavior, though that alone had been infuriating. It was the look in Harold's eyes, the quiet dignity mixed with years of unseen struggles. Outside the store, Harold walked slowly down the sidewalk, his bag of groceries cradled in one arm. He didn't live far, but the journey seemed longer today. His mind replayed the events in the store, each word and gesture etched vividly in his memory. He wasn't angry, not really. Harold had faced worse in his lifetime, moments where cruelty and hardship seemed to be constants. But today it felt different, sharper somehow. The slap hadn't just stung his shoulder, it had struck something deeper, a part of him that he rarely let anyone see. Yet, as much as the encounter hurt, there was also a flicker of warmth, a reminder that kindness still existed in the world. The stranger who had stood up for him, the man with the quiet strength and piercing eyes, had given Harold something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Back in the store, Keanu finally moved toward the door, his steps unhurried. He had no intention of confronting Arthur further. There was no point. People like him rarely changed overnight, if at all. As Keanu stepped outside, the cool evening air brushed against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth. He paused on the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something. A car engine roared to life nearby, drawing his attention. Arthur's sleek black sedan sped out of the parking lot, the tires screeching slightly as he turned onto the main road. Keanu watched it go, his expression thoughtful but calm. For a moment, he considered heading back to his quiet retreat, leaving the events of the day behind him. But something held him there, a nagging feeling he couldn't ignore. Farther down the street, Harold disappeared around a corner, his figure blending into the twilight. Keanu's gaze lingered in that direction, his instincts telling him that the story wasn't over yet. Let me know if you'd like to continue or refine any part of the narrative. Keanu stood on the sidewalk for a few moments longer, the cool breeze brushing past him as the faint hum of evening life settled over the small town. The shadows had grown longer now, stretching across the pavement like silent witnesses to what had just happened. Something about the encounter still tugged at him, a subtle but persistent pull that made it hard to walk away. Harold's retreating figure was no longer in sight, but Keanu couldn't help wondering about the old man's story. The way Harold had handled the situation, calmly, almost too resigned, spoke volumes. It wasn't the first time Harold had been treated poorly, that much was clear. Yet, the quiet strength in the man's eyes suggested he had endured far worse over the years. As Keanu began walking, his thoughts drifted. He wasn't a stranger to witnessing injustice. In his line of work and personal life, he'd encountered people who wielded power recklessly, believing themselves untouchable. Yet standing up for someone like Harold felt different, more personal somehow. He didn't have a destination in mind, but found himself wandering down the quiet street, the faint glow of shop windows lighting his path. He passed a small cafe where a few patrons sat outside, their laughter and conversation a gentle backdrop to the evening. Farther down, the town's park came into view, its benches empty save for a couple of teens sharing a bag of chips. Keanu's instincts told him he wasn't done here. There was more to the story, and he wanted to understand it. Meanwhile, Harold reached his modest home on the edge of town, the familiar creak of the wooden gate welcoming him back. His small house, surrounded by a patchwork of overgrown grass and fading flower beds, had seen better days, but it was home. He placed his groceries on the warm kitchen table, the quiet of the house enveloping him like an old, heavy coat. The stillness was comforting in some ways, yet tonight it felt heavier than usual. He couldn't stop thinking about the store, about Arthur's sharp words, and the stranger who had stepped in so unexpectedly. Harold moved to the living room, easing himself into an old armchair that creaked under his weight. His gaze settled on a framed photograph on the mantel, his late wife, Margaret, smiling in a sunlit field. Her presence was a constant source of comfort, even in her absence. "I wonder what you'd make of all this," Harold murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. At the same time, Arthur was driving down the main road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. He couldn't shake the sting of humiliation he'd felt in the store, the way that stranger had looked at him like he was some kind of villain. Arthur wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in front of an audience. He muttered under his breath, replaying the encounter in his mind. It wasn't his fault the old man had been slow. Why should he have to wait? Yet, a nagging discomfort gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. Arthur's car sped past Harold's house, his mind too preoccupied to notice the modest home or the man inside it. Back in town, Keanu found himself standing near the park, watching as the streetlights flickered to life. He didn't know much about Harold, but something told him the old man had more layers than met the eye. Keanu decided he'd try to find him again, to check in and perhaps learn more. The next morning, Harold was up early, as he always was. He spent the first hour tending to his small garden, pulling weeds and watering the few hardy plants that had survived the season. The routine brought him a sense of peace, a way to start the day on his own terms. But as he worked, a car pulled up to the curb. Harold straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans as he watched Keanu step out. "Morning," Keanu said, his voice friendly but measured. Harold hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Morning. Didn't expect to see you again." Keanu walked closer, his hands in his jacket pockets. "I wanted to check on you," he said, "after yesterday." Harold offered a faint smile, though his eyes were cautious. "I'm fine. You didn't have to go out of your way." "Sometimes it's worth going out of the way," Keanu replied. There was a pause as the two men sized each other up, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "You seem like you've been through a lot," Keanu said finally, his tone gentle but probing. Harold shrugged, glancing at the garden. "Haven't we all?" he said. "Life isn't always kind, but you learn to live with it." Keanu nodded, his respect for the older man growing. "Still, no one deserves to be treated the way you were yesterday." Harold didn't reply right away. Instead, he gestured toward the small bench near the garden. "You want to sit for a bit? Talk." Keanu accepted the invitation, sitting beside Harold as the two men shared a quiet moment. The conversation that followed was unhurried, filled with stories of Harold's past, his years as a farmer, the challenges he'd faced, and the love he'd lost. Keanu listened intently, his presence unassuming but deeply attentive. As Harold spoke, the faint hum of a car engine approached. Both men turned to see a black sedan pulling up to the curb. The door opened, and Arthur stepped out, his expression unreadable. Harold tensed slightly, while Keanu's eyes narrowed. Arthur took a few hesitant steps forward, his gaze shifting between the two men. "I wanted to talk," he said, his voice unusually subdued. Keanu and Harold exchanged a glance, the tension between them palpable. Whatever Arthur had to say, it was clear that this story was far from over. Arthur stood there, shifting awkwardly, as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. The air between the three men felt thick, heavy with unspoken words, and the tension of unresolved conflict. Harold remained seated, his eyes cautious but steady, while Keanu stayed silent, his gaze fixed on Arthur, studying his every move. I've been thinking about what happened yesterday," Arthur began, his voice faltering slightly. I didn't mean for things to go the way they did." Harold tilted his head, the faintest flicker of skepticism crossing his face. "Didn't mean to slap me, or didn't mean to get caught?" he asked, his tone calm but pointed. Arthur flinched at the question, his confidence visibly wavering. "Look, I'm not proud of what I did," he said, his voice quieter now. "I don't know why I lost my temper like that. It's just been a lot lately, work, pressure, everything piling up. I took it out on you, and that wasn't right." Keanu leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Why are you here now?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Arthur hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I came to apologize," he said finally. I know I was out of line, and I want to make things right. Harold studied him for a long moment, his weathered face giving nothing away. You think saying sorry is going to fix everything? He asked, his voice tinged with quiet resignation. Arthur looked down at the ground, his polished shoes scuffing against the dirt. I don't know, he admitted, but I thought it was a start. Keanu's eyes didn't leave Arthur, the silence stretching between them like a taut rope. Words are easy, he said finally. It's actions that matter. Arthur looked up, his eyes meeting Keanu's for the first time. I know that, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. But what else am I supposed to do? I can't take back what happened. No, Harold said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. You can't. The three men sat in the stillness for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging over them. Somewhere in the distance, the faint chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves filled the silence, but it did little to ease the tension. Harold finally stood, his movements slow but deliberate. He looked directly at Arthur, his gaze steady. If you're serious about wanting to make things right, then prove it, he said. Not just with me, but with how you treat people from now on. Arthur seemed taken aback by the directness of Harold's words, but he nodded, his jaw tightening as if steeling himself. I'll do better, he said. I promise. Keanu stood as well, his tall frame casting a shadow over the two men. Promises are just the beginning, he said. Let's see if you follow through. Arthur nodded again, his face a mixture of determination and uncertainty. He glanced at Harold one last time before turning and walking back to his car. As he got in and drove away, the tension seemed to dissipate, though it left an uneasy silence in its wake. Harold watched the car disappear down the road, then turned to Keanu. Do you think he meant it? He asked quietly. Keanu shrugged, his expression thoughtful. People can change, he said, but it's not easy. Time will tell. Harold nodded slowly, his gaze distant. I suppose so. But even as the two men exchanged those words, neither could shake the feeling that something unresolved lingered in the air. For Harold, it was the uncertainty of whether Arthur's apology was genuine or just a way to ease his own guilt. For Keanu, it was a deeper instinct, a sense that the story wasn't finished yet. As the day wore on, Harold returned to his quiet routines, tending to his garden and tinkering with small repairs around the house. Keanu, however, couldn't settle. He found himself wandering the town, observing the ebb and flow of daily life, his thoughts constantly circling back to Harold and Arthur. By evening, the small town seemed to hold its breath, the warm glow of sunset casting long shadows across the streets. Keanu decided to pay Harold one more visit, a nagging feeling urging him to check in. When he arrived, the house was quiet, the lights inside glowing faintly against the encroaching darkness. Keanu knocked lightly on the door, and after a moment, Harold opened it, his face lighting up with a small, surprised smile. Didn't expect to see you again so soon, Harold said, stepping aside to let Keanu in. I had a feeling I should stop by, Keanu said, his tone casual but laced with an undercurrent of seriousness. As the two men sat in the living room, the conversation turned to lighter topics: Harold's farming days, stories of his late wife, and the quirks of small-town life. But just as the mood began to relax, a sudden noise outside broke the tranquility. Both men froze, their eyes meeting briefly before Keanu stood, his instincts kicking in. Harold followed, his brow furrowed with concern. Stepping onto the porch, they saw a figure standing near the edge of Harold's property, partially obscured by the dim light of the street lamp. The figure didn't move, just stood there watching. Do you know them? Keanu asked, his voice low but alert. Harold shook his head, his eyes narrowing. No, he said quietly. Keanu took a step forward, his gaze fixed on the shadowy figure. Hey, he called out, his voice firm. The figure didn't respond, but after a moment, they turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving an eerie stillness behind. Harold exhaled slowly, his shoulders tense. "That was strange," he murmured. Keanu nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah," he said, his voice laced with unease. Neither man knew who the figure was or why they had been there, but the encounter left an undeniable sense of foreboding. It was clear that the tension surrounding the events of the past few days was far from over. Harold lingered on the porch after the figure disappeared into the shadows, the cool night air prickling his skin. He glanced at Keanu, who was still staring into the darkness, his expression serious and thoughtful. There was something unspoken between them, an acknowledgement that this was more than just a random stranger passing through. "You think that was Arthur?" Harold asked quietly, though he didn't entirely believe it himself. Keanu shook his head, his instincts telling him otherwise. "Doesn't seem like his style," he said. "But whoever it was, they didn't want to be seen." Harold sighed, leaning against the railing. "I don't like this," he admitted. "First the store, now this. Feels like something's brewing." Keanu didn't reply immediately. Instead, he scanned the quiet street, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the empty road. The town, so peaceful on the surface, now felt like it was hiding secrets just below the calm. As they stood there, Harold's phone buzzed inside the house. He frowned and went to retrieve it, leaving Keanu on the porch. When Harold returned, his face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he held the phone. "What is it?" Keanu asked, his voice steady but laced with concern. Harold handed him the phone without a word. The screen displayed a text message from an unknown number, the words stark against the glowing background. "You should have stayed quiet. This isn't over." Keanu's jaw tightened as he read the message, the implications clear. Whoever had sent it wasn't just angry. They were trying to intimidate Harold into silence. "Have you gotten anything like this before?" Keanu asked, his tone calm but urgent. Harold shook his head. "Never," he said. "But I can guess what it's about." Keanu raised an eyebrow, waiting for Harold to continue. "There was a time years ago when I spoke up against some things happening in this town," Harold said slowly, his voice tinged with reluctance. "Land deals, shady contracts, stuff most people didn't want to touch. It didn't make me many friends." Keanu frowned, piecing things together. "And now someone thinks you're a threat again?" Harold nodded. "Maybe they think I'll stir up trouble. Or maybe this is just payback for speaking out in the first place." Keanu looked at the message again, his mind working quickly. "Whoever sent this isn't just upset about the store," he said. "This goes deeper." Before Harold could respond, there was a sudden sound, a loud bang from the side of the house. Both men jumped, their adrenaline spiking. Keanu moved quickly, motioning for Harold to stay back as he stepped off the porch to investigate. The side yard was dimly lit, the shadows deep and unsettling. Keanu's sharp eyes scanned the area, his ears tuned to every sound. Then he saw it, a shattered window near the back of the house, the glass glinting under the faint moonlight. "Someone's trying to send a message," Keanu muttered as Harold joined him, his face etched with worry. "This is getting out of hand," Harold said, his voice shaking slightly. "Why now? Why after all these years?" Keanu didn't answer immediately. He crouched near the broken window, examining the scene. It didn't look like an attempt to break in, more like an act of intimidation, a warning. "We need to report this," Keanu said firmly, standing and facing Harold. Harold hesitated. "And what if that just makes things worse?" he asked. "What if whoever's doing this gets even bolder?" Keanu's expression softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "Staying silent won't stop them," he said. "If anything, it'll just encourage them." Harold muttered reluctantly, realizing Keanu was right. The two men went back inside, locking the doors and windows as best they could. Harold made the call to the local authorities, explaining the situation in as much detail as he could. When the call ended, Harold sank into his armchair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "This used to be such a quiet town," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I thought I'd left all this behind." Keanu sat across from him, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the past has a way of catching up," he said. "But that doesn't mean you have to face it alone." Harold glanced at him, a faint flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "Thanks for sticking around," he said. Keanu nodded, his gaze steady. "We'll figure this out," he said. "One way or another." But as the night wore on, the unease lingered, wrapping around them like a thick fog. Outside, the quiet town seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next move in a game no one wanted to play. Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that whoever was behind this wasn't done yet. And as the hours stretched into the early morning, a new question began to form in Keanu's mind. A question that would change everything once answered. Who, or what, was Harold truly up against? The storm had been raging for hours, but inside the abandoned mansion, the air was still, as though even time had paused. Avery stood in the center of the dark room, the only light coming from the flickering candle on the floor. Her breath was shallow, heart pounding in her chest. Every step she took seemed to echo in the silence, reminding her of the danger she was in. Somewhere in the shadows, she knew that Jack was lurking. She could feel his presence, like a ghost, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her mind raced through all the twists and turns that had led her here. She thought she had figured it all out, piecing together the clues. Jack was the one behind the mysterious disappearances. He had manipulated everyone around him, drawing them into a web of lies, including herself. But now, as she looked around, everything seemed different. The mansion's grand walls, once a symbol of wealth, now seemed like a prison, trapping her with the man who had twisted her life. Suddenly, a soft sound broke the stillness, a whisper. She turned, but the room remained empty. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Avery, I'm here." Her heart skipped. It was Jack's voice. She followed the sound, moving cautiously toward a hidden door she had only noticed moments ago. With trembling hands, she pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the darkness. She hesitated, but then she heard it again, closer this time, as if Jack was right behind her. She descended, each step creaking beneath her weight. At the bottom of the stairs, a dim light flickered. She squinted and saw him, Jack, standing in the middle of a dimly lit room. But something wasn't right. He didn't seem like the man she had known. His face was twisted, his eyes hollow. "You should have never come here, Avery," he murmured, his voice low and ominous. "You were never meant to find out." Before she could react, he lunged at her, but she was ready. She had anticipated this moment, had trained for it. As she reached for the knife she had hidden in her jacket, a loud bang echoed through the room. Jack froze, his face pale as his body jerked forward. Behind him stood Sarah, Avery's closest friend, holding a gun. Her hands shook, but her resolve was unwavering. "Get away from her, Jack," Sarah shouted. "It's over." Avery stood still, her mind racing. Sarah. It was her all along. The woman she had trusted, the woman she had thought was on her side. The woman who had known more than she had let on. It all made sense now. The late-night phone calls, the hidden messages, the way Sarah had subtly led her into the trap. But before she could confront Sarah, Jack let out a laugh, a sick, twisted laugh. "You think it's over," he sneered. "You've been played, Avery. Both of you." And then the room seemed to tremble, the walls closing in. The floor beneath them cracked open, revealing a hidden underground chamber. One filled with more mysteries, more lies. Avery's heart raced. What was this place? Why was it still hidden? In an instant, Sarah's gun was turned on her. Jack's expression shifted to one of pure rage. "You were never meant to leave. None of you were." The final twist had come. The real truth was far darker than either of them had imagined. The mansion, the disappearances, the twisted game, they had all been part of something bigger. And now, as the walls closed in around them, there was no escape. The truth had been revealed, but the cost was greater than anyone could have imagined. The storm outside intensified as the mansion seemed to collapse inward. The floor beneath them seemed to tremble once more, and Avery's eyes widened as the ground split open. She had only a split second to react, her instincts screaming at her to move. She grabbed Sarah's arm, yanking her away from the jagged edge that had suddenly appeared beneath their feet. Jack was too close to the opening, and before either of them could reach him, the ground caved in beneath him. A scream echoed through the dark room, but it was swallowed by the deafening crash as he disappeared into the abyss below. Avery stood frozen, her chest heaving. The storm outside raged louder than ever, but inside the mansion, the eerie silence hung heavy. The adrenaline still coursed through her veins as she turned to face Sarah, whose gun was still clutched tightly in her hand. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah's gaze was distant, her face unreadable. Avery could feel the tension between them, the weight of everything that had happened. Why? Avery finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes flickered to her, and then she lowered the gun, letting it fall to her side. "I didn't want this," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret. "I never wanted any of this to happen. But Jack, he had leverage. He made me do things. I thought I could outsmart him, but I didn't have a choice anymore. I was just as trapped as you were." Avery processed the words, feeling a strange mixture of relief and betrayal. She had known Sarah for years, trusted her completely, and yet here she was, admitting to being a part of it all. The web of lies, the manipulation, it had all been too much. And for what? To survive? To keep Jack's secret hidden. "I didn't know it would go this far," Sarah continued, her voice cracking. "I thought I could just get you to leave before it all spiraled out of control. But then I realized I was already too deep. Jack was always one step ahead." Avery shook her head, not knowing whether to feel sorry for Sarah or furious with her. She had been a pawn in Jack's game, just like Avery. But unlike Avery, Sarah had made the choice to stay, to play along. And now, it was too late. "You still could have told me," Avery said, her voice hardening. "You could have trusted me." "I was scared," Sarah admitted, looking down at her feet. "Jack threatened to hurt everyone I loved. I thought he would kill me if I didn't do what he wanted. But when I saw you getting closer to the truth, I realized I had to act. I couldn't let him hurt you too." Avery took a deep breath, the weight of it all sinking in. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to scream, to lash out at Sarah for betraying her. But there was no time for that now. Jack was gone, but the mansion was still standing, the storm still howling outside, and there were so many unanswered questions. What was the truth about this place? Why had Jack come here in the first place? What was the hidden chamber beneath them? "I think we need to get out of here," Avery said, her voice firm now, "before this place drags us down with it." Sarah nodded, her expression filled with something that resembled guilt, but also relief. "You're right. I don't belong here anymore." The two of them made their way through the crumbling mansion, avoiding the cracks in the floor as they moved. The storm outside was as fierce as ever, but there was a strange calm settling over them, as if the worst was finally over. They reached the front door, the air outside cool and fresh compared to the stifling atmosphere inside. Avery paused for a moment, looking back at the mansion, its once grand architecture now decaying and abandoned. It had been a symbol of wealth and power, but now it stood as a reminder of the lies and secrets that had nearly consumed her. As they stepped out into the rain-soaked yard, Avery realized that Jack's death had not been a victory. It had been a tragic end to a long and twisted story. The mansion, the disappearances, the deception, it was all connected, but the true meaning of it remained elusive. The things they had learned had changed them both, and it was clear that their lives would never be the same. They walked in silence for a while, the rain falling softly around them. Avery could feel Sarah's eyes on her, but she didn't know what to say. There was nothing left to say. The truth had come out, but it had come at a cost. There were no winners here. Eventually, they reached the main road, where an old car was parked. Avery didn't know where it had come from, but at that moment, it didn't matter. She was tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of the secrets. Tired of being manipulated. She just wanted to go home. Sarah hesitated before getting into the car. Avery, I don't know how to make things right. I've ruined everything. Avery turned to her, her expression unreadable. You can't undo what's been done, she said. But you can start over. We both can. Sarah nodded, and the two of them got into the car, the engine starting with a quiet hum. As they drove away from the mansion, Avery allowed herself a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past finally begin to lift. The storm was still raging, but the road ahead was clearer now. The mansion would be left behind, its secrets buried in the crumbling walls, and Avery would go on, carrying the lessons learned from the darkness that had nearly consumed her. She knew she would never forget what had happened, but she also knew that life had a way of moving forward, even after the storm. As the car disappeared into the night, Avery couldn't help but reflect on everything she had endured. The lies, the betrayal, the secrets, it had all been part of a bigger story. But in the end, she had found the truth. She had found her way out. And no matter what came next, that would be enough.